Welcome back, everyone, to Pontos Fathom Press. This is Pontos Fathom Podcast, episode 14, discussing End of Evangelion, Carl Jung's Aion, and Apocalyptic anime. Yes, continuing our Neon Genesis Evangelion series of podcasts this month, and I'm sort of structuring these, at least off the bat, as things about Freud. In the last topic, just really focusing on the original Neon Genesis Evangelion. If you want to check out that podcast, we really get into the concept of how, just like Anno mines Christianity for world building and for his storytelling, and for some of the resonances that we get out of why there's a greatness in Neon Genesis Evangelion. He also seems to be mining, consciously or unconsciously, the psychoanalytical process. Right. So in a way, Evangelion has a therapeutic kind of storyline, right? So the hero's, the classical hero's journey has been one of giant robot, big monster, robot kills monster, everyone's happy. This one's more like giant robots beat up by monster, people's lives are shattered, apocalypse, something like this, right? So I think that kind of subversion and what gets discovered as the story unfolds throughout Neon Genesis Evangelion was sort of the topic of the first one. But those themes really apply across all of Evangelion. And so today we're going to talk a bit about End of Evangelion. And that's sort of the, Anno's return to probably the last two chapters of Neon Genesis Evangelion, which were very internal, psychoanalytical, psychological episodes that are really about the kind of what's going on in Shinji's mind, what's going on with these impacts, right, with this human Gendo's project, right, and human instrumentality. So today I want to focusing on End of Evangelion, and here we've got a picture of the classic mass production angels, that Asuka, that's a great scene with the mass production angels, and very apocalyptic also, right? This is a classic scene from End of Evangelion. So let's kind of do a little bit of background on Jung. Let's do a little bit of background on why there was an End of Evangelion and what it sort of signifies. End of Evangelion for sure is a fan favorite. It's one of my favorites, and I think it really captures some very interesting points. And we're going to reach into Carl Jung's Aion here, Phenomenology of the Self, because a lot of what's going on in Evangelion is about the self. It's not only about Shinji's self, but the weird architecture of the self, in the sense that you've got an Ava, you've got a pilot inside the LCL, you've got ATF fields, Avas fight angels, and then this question kind of comes out in the second, third impacts, especially as we get into rebuild later. Why do we have Evangelions? Like, angels are Evangelions. There's all this kind of confusion around the self. So phenomenology of the self, Jung's work in the Aion, is a little bit like Jung's End of Evangelion, right? This is the book that terrified Jordan Peterson. It's got a lot of culmination of Jung's phenomenology of the collective unconscious, and also some inklings into his alchemical and Gnostic sort of researches. So we'll go into this a bit. I'll also be talking about alchemy, mysterium conjunctionis, some of these mysteries that come up. And we'll talk a little bit about the break between Freud and Jung. So we'll kind of use that as, just like Anno has a break with the fans, and the fans have a break between like the mecha fans versus the emo fans of Evangelion. We'll sort of say it that way. So let's kind of go into next. We'll talk about End of Evangelion kind of comes out of, in a way, the success of Neon Genesis Evangelion, right? There was a huge success. People really identified with the Evangelion concepts, the mecha, the story, and then they were left with the final 2 episodes, which were very apocalyptic, right? I think there's certain fans who like it, but the fans are always going to be torn, right? So Anno comes back, definitely is something that you could get commercial success from. At the same time, he's Anno, right? And he has his own ways of looking at it. So what you have with the end of Evangelion is a sort of a retelling of the end of Neon Genesis Evangelion. And it's done in a 2-chapter format, but it's more of an external look, right? So you have an internal look and an external look. And I think that it's in some ways I was talking about Anno's break with the fans, but you do see this sort of break that happens. And I want to kind of highlight out some differences between Jung and Freud, right? So there's the Freudian school of analysis, and Freud is in a lot of ways the founder or the grandfather of psychoanalysis, right? And at the same time, Jung was his student, but then Jung went off in a very different direction. And I think that this break, where Freud kept things grounded in the topics of neuroses and analysis, Jung started to move more into mythology and like a philosophy of psychology, right? And he wanted to look at beyond, the way we are traumatized, perhaps, or the way our family structure worked, or Freud was very much grounded in the psychoanalytic practice. And even though he has theoretical works, and even though he has interesting founding exploration, right, just amazing. And we'll go into Freud, the rebuild of Freud, in our next podcast, talking about Lacan, because Lacan will go back and look at Freud and sort of say, hey, we'll look at how Freud was doing this, but now we see this perspective, right? And I think Anno does that with Rebuild of Evangelion. So we'll kind of go into that in that phase. But sticking with the Jung break with Freud, Jung started exploring different things. Jung started exploring how he saw in his patient's dream work alchemical and religious themes that resolved in the same way that the mythology resolved. So this is where Jung got really into, like Terence McKenna says, the books that the Jungians don't read, right? So you've got Mysterium Conjunctionis, which is his union of opposites, right? And the alchemical work, where Jung really starts to explore these things. So if we take a look at how End of Evangelion comes up, it's really Shinji is basically bringing the apocalypse forward, right, in a lot of ways. And maybe Gendo has engineered it with human instrumentality, but you can see all of these psychological forces, in a way, around Shinji, whether it's his mother in the Eva, his mother is the clone Rei is symbolic children of Adam and Lilith, and not just Rei, but the Evangelion program and their relation to Adam and Lilith, right? So maybe we'll jump in there. I think that's a good place to jump in. So first of all, let's talk about the self. So Jung kind of talks a lot about his phenomenology of the self with some terms. So in the Jungian view, and I think I'll bring this up because I think this kind of relates to how our Eva pilots are fragmented somewhat when they're in their Eva. So there's always this kind of weird mitigating circumstances or drama about, and even later on in Rebuild, when Mari talks about the smell of the LCL, or this confusion about which pilot can operate which Evangelion, because the Evangelion is based on a human, And in Shinji's case, it's his mother, so it's such a natural connection. It's child returned to the womb, something like this. But psychologically, Jung sort of explored this idea of the self is a much more complex egg. So the self has things like the conscious self, which is your ego, right? But there's also in the conscious side of the self, there's the idea of the persona. So you have an ego, but you also have this public-facing persona. So we can see like Asuka has I'm the strong girl, I'm the fierce fighter. But then she kind of goes off and she has her odd doll conversations, right? Which is sort of now it starts to go into the unconscious space. So we have the self, which is the self is sort of bigger than the sum of all your parts, right? And the conscious parts are the ones you sort of know about consciously, like your ego. And your persona is the ones that you publicly show. But then below the line, we have the unconscious, right? And then Freud kind of breaks the unconscious out. So say we go back to Asuka again. Her doll talks really are deep dives into her complexes, her anima and animus, and her shadow, right? So she's got some trauma around her mother traumatizing her mother's death. She also has some strange relations to men that she wrestles with, right? And I think that some of these things, Jung kind of calls out in the idea of in the unconscious that he found structures there. There's the relating function, which he kind of called the anima, which is it's a feminine function in the idea that, we're all children of a father and a mother, right? And then from there, we get relations to what our relating function is and what our animus function is, from the people that raise us or how we're raised, or from our social interactions, right? We see how different people relate and how different people act strongly, so on the animus side. And so we see kind of this animus possession in Asuka. We see this anima possession in Shinji. We see this similar disaffected sort of distancing from experience in the clone Rei or the real Rei, or is she real? Is she a clone? Right? She's a clone, right? And then, but she's actually one that's learning among her friends, right? So this Rei also becomes symbolic of many things because she is more than what she seems, right? Gendo has got plans for her. And then we'll see that in the Lilith and Adam story. So one of the things that come out of this is this syzygy. So let's go into what Jung says about the syzygy here. He says, the syzygy is the anima and animus. So what is the connections, he says? The spinning woman Maya creates illusions by her dancing. Had we not long known the symbolism of dreams, the son's relation to the mother is real, to her imago, and to the woman who has become a mother for him. His eros has passed like a child. He hopes to be caught, sucked in, enveloped, and devoured. Right? He seeks the protecting, nourishing, charmed circle of the mother, the condition of the infant released from care. So here you see our young 14-year-old Eva pilots inside their Evangelions, kind of safe, kind of in the womb of LCL fluid, right? Where does the guilt lie? With the mother or with the son? Presumably with both. And here Jung kind of talks about the way the syzygy forms a mysterium conjunctionis. It's a opposite, but it's a union, right? The pilot becomes the Eva in a lot of ways, right? The LCL breaks down the walls, and that's where we start seeing some of that amazing visuals that Anna produces for us, where the pilots start to lose it a bit. So then lastly, just on the self, we'll talk about the idea of the assimilation of the self. It must be reckoned a psychic catastrophe when the ego is assimilated by the self. The image of wholeness then remains in the unconscious, so that on the one hand it shares the archaic nature of the unconscious, and the other hand finds itself in the psychically relative space-time continuum that is a characteristic of the unconscious as such. Both of these qualities are numinous and hence have an unlimited determining effect on ego consciousness. It is a vital necessity that it should be so. If the ego fails at any length of time under the control of the unconscious factor, its adaptation is disturbed and the way is open for all sorts of possible accidents. Now this almost reads like an Evangelion battle, right? The idea is, your ego can be shattered, just like the battery runs out in the Evangelion, and then all this other chaos happens. Or the pilot of the Evangelion has some misalignment with the synchronization with the Eva, and we have the Evas that have gone haywire, like in End of Evangelion. But then you have the total opposite of all this. There's that apocalyptic side of End of Evangelion, but then you still have Shinji failing. He's rolled up in the ball again, right? He doesn't want to play. He wants to revert from all activity. And it comes to, Asuka meets her end in this space against the mass production angels. Lastly, here we'll just say accentuation of the ego personality and the world of consciousness may easily assume such proportions that the figures of the unconscious are psychologized, and the self consequently becomes assimilated into the ego. Now, this is some weird things, right? The self being assimilated into the ego. It's like you think you are your ego as opposed to your wholeness, right? So, although this is the exact opposite of the process we have just described, it follows by the same result, inflation, right? Asuka's ego inflation. She thinks she can do it all. The world of consciousness now must be leveled down in favor of the reality of the unconscious. In the first case, reality has to be protected against the archaic, external, and ubiquitous dream state. So here we kind of go into this, like when we lose that balance, it's very, very risky. For instance, a person who is not conscientious enough to make up a moral effort in order to come up to the mark, right, like Shinji. While for one who is sufficiently rooted in the world through his own efforts and no moral achievement to inflict defeat on the virtues by losing the ties to the world and reducing his adaptive performance. This is like Asuka losing heart, right? And we have finally in the end, Rei who comes to the rescue all the time. Rei's really self-sacrificing. She comes to the rescue. Okay, so that's a little bit about the self, about the animus and the syzygy. I also want to talk a bit about the shadow, right? So Jung talks about the shadow, but just quick mention of that is the idea that there are parts of ourselves that we don't want to see, right? We don't want to see certain parts of ourselves. And I think that this is the shadow work. When we talk about the shadow work, is making that unconscious force that's a negative side of us conscious. And we can kind of see Anno doing this maybe by rebuild. But I think with End of Evangelion, he's sort of really lashing out a bit. At the same time, he's trying to express some of the things visually. He is an artist still, so he is able to do both, right? So what do you guys think? Leave a message in the chat. Just while we were talking about that, I just want to shout out quickly, we're working on some new books. The Impedance and Admittance in Desiring Machines and Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence. These are in proof. We'll be getting these out shortly. But speaking of the apocalypse, you can check out Ben Samagos' Flowing the Tears of a Flesh Android, the curiously short presidency of Biden, in which the continuity of government team in a low orbital satellite is flowing the tears of the candidate, making sure the solemnity test is up to muster, administered by commandant of injectable life-extending stimulants, Rona Crown, right-hand man to the flesh android in chief, and various hijinks he runs into going haywire as the tentacles disattach from his spinal column. So that'll be an interesting book to check out if you're interested in the apocalypse, and we really support the channel, so we appreciate your help. So let's talk a little bit about Adam. Let's talk a little bit about Adam and Lilith, which are kind of part of this mythology of End of Evangelion. And I wanted to go into the concepts that we see both of Adam and Lilith. because I think that these are quite strange occurrences in the Eva series, right? They're very mysteriously done. They're not well described. And I think the first one here this is very interesting that I found this in Mysterium Conjunctionis by Jung. It says, the reference to sulfur as an arcane and transformative substance must suffice. So it starts going off about sulfur, the Christ lapis, the colors, the grove of Venus. As we saw, he fell asleep after having a long and instructive conversation with the voice of Saturn. In his dream, he beholds the figures of two men by the fountain in the grove of Saturn. There's an incurable wound, and blood pours, and we have red blood, right? Blood pours, and just think of the imagery of Evangelion when I say this. The blood pours from it in the form of whitest milk. And as the adept sinks deeper into dreams, it changes to a river. So now we're in a river of milk. And I think about this white and red colors that are in End of Evangelion. We see it in the angels, right? We see it in the mass production Evangelions, right? The red lips and the white. But then we see it later as Rei reincarnates white, right? And then we see the blood of not only of the destroyed angels, but also of the third impact, second impact, the third impacts, the various impacts, right? And we also see that sort of like this idea, as it says, bodies appear floating, their souls above the water, and they go back into bodies so polluted and glad to be quit of them. The world would remain afloat until the fogs and clouds have disappeared. So it's a sulfuric dream that's going on. And it says here, this is where it's interesting, we learn further that sulfur is not only the medicina, but also the medicus, the wounded physician. Sulfur suffers the same fate as the body that is pierced by the lance of Mercurius. In Rausner's Pandora, the body is symbolized as Christ, the second Adam, pierced by the lance of a mermaid, or a Lilith, or an Adam, right? So here you have, you have everything here. You've got a lance, you've got a crucified Christ, the second Adam. Christ is the second Adam. So we have that Adam Lilith connection. We have the crucifixion imagery. And we also have the lance of the mermaid, which, although we call it the spear of Longinus or the spear of Cassius, we have a mention to Lilith. So here we have this kind of return that Anno does with End of Evangelion and with the series in general. Let's kind of go into Adam a bit. So we found a reference to Lilith and Adam. Let's kind of keep going down in this. So into that, and of course Anno says, oh yeah, the mythology is nonsense, and we know that it's not really Christianity here, and we're not really talking that Evangelion is some kind of prophetic thing, but more from a point of view of world building, more from a point of view of if we look at Jungian archetypes, right? The idea of Jungian archetypes is very interesting because Jung sees that our unconscious, and this could be the unconscious of the viewers of End of Evangelion, of the creators of it, or even of the artists, our unconscious, sort of in Jung's view, was a pipeline to the influences of human cultural and activity. You have hero myths, you have gods of the mountain, you have the fish myth, you have a number of interesting things that come up. And I think that this is where we're sort of planting that idea, and we'll keep going into this Adam and Lilith connection. So it says, according to the rabbinic view, Adam even had a tail. His condition at first was altogether most inauspicious. As he lay still inanimate on the ground, he was of a greenish hue, with thousands of impure spirits fluttering around. But God shooed them away until only one remained, Lilith, the mistress of spirits, who succeeded in so attaching herself to Adam's body that she became with child by him. Only when Eve appeared did she fly away again. Only when the Eva appeared, right? So this is such a weird stuff that Anno has tapped into, right? Because here we have these old old texts, not even biblical. These are sort of mythological texts even, right? The rabbinical works of Jeremiah ben Elazar, right? And Adam has many faces, just like the many eyes of Anno's vision in End of Evangelion, right? But God shooed them away until only one remained. Lilith, the mistress of spirits, who succeeded became with child, and then only when Eve appeared did she fly away again. And we sort of see like that image of Ray sort of rising up, white and kind of floating over everyone. Right? Ray as the post-impact view. So let's keep on going. It says, this throws a bad light. The daimonic Lilith seems to be a certain aspect of Adam, for the legend says that she was created from him with the same earth. It throws a bad light on Adam's nature when we are told that countless demons and spooks arouse from his nocturnal emissions, ex nocturno seminis fluix. This happened during 130 years in which he had to spend apart from Eve, banished from the heavenly court. Well, if that's not reminding us of the opening scene of End of Evangelion, I don't know what is, but it's odd, right? And you can see how when you get into this stuff of the unconscious, how there are all these resonances. And I think part of those resonances and exposing us to them are what makes End of Evangelion so interesting, right? So let's keep going here, just a little bit further. In Gnosticism, the original man, Adamus, who was nothing but a paraphrase of Adam, was equated to the ipthephalic Hermes with the Corybus, the seducer of Dionysus, as well as the Calibri, the Pistis Sophia, who met the Sabaoth Adamus, the ruler of the Aeon. And then it keeps going on. Adam was created by Sataniel, God's first son and the fallen angel. So here they're saying that Adam was created, in this myth, according to the teaching of the Balgamels, Adam was created by a fallen agent called Sataniel. Sataniel was unable to bring him to life, so God did it for him. And you kind of see that weird, Adam is the Homo Maximus, the Anthropos, right? So you have this Mandean talk, this idea of the Anthropos, humanity, right? Human instrumentality projects, the weird nature of how Chrono and Ray seem to resonate a bit differently than the rest of the characters, in that they are sort of hybrid creatures or demigod-like or clones or something like that. There's a very strange nature to them. Okay, so let's keep going here. I just wanted to call out a couple ideas. If we look at so let's go back to Jung, and we'll talk a little bit about his Aion. So inside his Aion, I just wanted to show some of these alchemical imagery. So one thing that Jung was big on is, like I mentioned with dreams, one can analyze the dreams, and Jung would find things like the hero's tale or these stories that resonated with mythology. And I think that this activity that Jung would do with the collective unconscious was a tool, so to speak, to understand how we are, how the self can be found inside of, our the self is bigger than the activity of just the conscious or the unconsciousness. And what we find in dreams through alchemy is sort of a way to know the self, a way to surface the unconscious, things like this. So if we go into, I'm just taking, this is a book by Edward Edinger. It's commentary on the Aion book. So we'll kind of just reach into this just to get some ideas that I wanted to share. First of all, there was this idea about the turning of the heavens, right? So the idea that the wheel of the stars is turning, but this reminds me of the opening of End of Evangelion, where you have that drop. And it also reminds me of sort of like that feelings that we get in End of Evangelion when you start having the third impact sort of feel, right? So, scenes from inside of the Evas as the world starts to change. And you can see that these charts that Jung shows us, this is about the flow of Pisces across the sky. We also have this dream interpretations, and they remind me of some of the imagery, even from the imagery of the screens of inside of Nerve, right? So, there's kind of like this weird techno jargon that goes out through all of End of Evangelion and Neon Genesis Evangelion, where these screens and heads-up displays tell us about, they give authority to the state of the Eva, and at the same time there's this mystical nature to things. So one thing that Jung comes up with, and this might kind of remind us of Cele, right? The idea here is there's some kind of tribunal, or there's some kind of structure in place, and Gendo's put himself against it. And there's all kinds of fan theories. We're not going to go into that, but there's lots of, if you're interested in that, lots of different content out there to describe this. What this is really about here is these systematic ladder, this lapis quaternio, where we go from the rotundum to the lapis to the serpent to the man. And they're always made up of these four characters. For example, you have, in one you have the serpent and Adam, right, in the Garden of Eden. Or you might have Christ and Satan in another kind of relation. So it's like Jung has put together these relation matrices. And you can almost think of it as, AT fields. You can think of it as just the relation. Think of it this way. Shinji, his mother, Rei, and the Eva, right? And there's a complex quaternary that goes on there, right? Shinji's relation to his mom. Shinji came from his mom. She's his mother. But then Shinji's mom is the Eva, which Shinji pilots. Shinji has a relation to the Eva. And then Shinji's Eva, or Shinji Eva, has a relation to Rei. They fight side by side. They're protecting each other. Even the opening scene of Neon Genesis, Shinji has a moment of compassion where his cowardice is overcome by his care for the injured Rei, and he decides to go and fight in the Evangelion. And then you have this Shinji-Rei relation. Rei wanted to bring Gendo to dinner. Rei comes to save Shinji. Rei doesn't want Shinji to fight anymore, something like this. But then in the end, Shinji saves the mother. Shinji saves Rei. Shinji will destroy the world to save the one, right? And you start having this this is the stuff of Apocalypse, right? This is the apocalyptic component to it, where the world is willing to come to end for certain of these prophecies to come true, right? And I think that that's very interesting. And here you sort of see another chart that sort of maps out all of this propheticness. And here we say, I mentioned the formula is quite similar to a vision of Ezekiel. You notice that the formula of the four quaternaries, each of its four corners represents itself in the other four quaternaries. So this is the daisy chain of, then there's another quaternary, Gendo, human instrumentality, Yui, and Rei, right? So Gendo's got this human instrumentality project. Yui was involved with it, and then Rei is the clone, but then Rei also intersects with the Shinji quaternary, right? So you start to use this quaternary, and I'm just saying, listen, just like Gendo uses religion, it may just be, we can just ground it as a world-building technique, or the reason why Evangelion resonates with us so much, right? And there's that Ouroboros concept too. I believe, if we look into one of the books, maybe in Alchemy, you can see the Ouroboros is the serpent that's consuming his own tail, right? So I think that that's another image. You guys have seen it. This is not the Ouroboros, but this sort of has that view of human instrumentality, where the line across the moon, and those alchemical ideas that come up. Okay, so then let's go into the final stretch here. So I want to go back into Jung's Aion and talk a little bit about those those apocalyptic ideas. Right, so we have we have this idea. It says, as to the 5,000 years, the date we get is AD 1239. There was an epoch noted for the spiritual instability, the revolutionary heresies, and the new age of the spirit. So there was Joachim of Flora in the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. He expected the opening of the seventh seal in the fairly near future, the advent of the everlasting gospel, right? The Evangelium. We have Evangelion here. We'll keep going on. The reign of the Intellectus Spiritualis in the age of the Holy Ghost. This third aeon, he said, had already begun with Saint Benedict, the founder of the Benedictine order. One of Saint Joachim's followers, the Franciscan friar Gerard of Borgo San Dominio, proclaimed in his Introductionis in Evangelium Aeternum, which translates to his introduction to the eternal Evangelium, which appeared in 1254 in Paris. The year 1260 would replace the Gospel of Jesus. And we are also known in Joachim's monasteries as the true vehicle of the Holy Ghost. So here I just wanted to kind of bring this up, moving into the apocalyptic side of things, that we start to see, there's lots of biblical imagery in this. But Jung had this kind of idea about what the consequences of an apocalypse or a second coming was. So let's just say there is a confusion with End of Evangelion, right? We mash up a lot of things. We've got this Christian Evangelion stuff happening. We've got Nerve being conquered. Everything's coming to an end. And then there's this sort of redeeming moment maybe of Shinji saving Rei is one of them. But we also have the idea that something else is happening in this end of all things. You sort of see that epic Hey Jude moment at the end of the show where the song's playing and the second impact is unfolding. That I feel is very, very, very much in the spirit of Japanese apocalyptic anime. And I think that we can kind of find some more insights here through Jung with this apocalyptic side. So let's go back to Adam again, because while we have Adam as the originator, we have the idea of the second coming as, well, we know that Jesus is thought of as a second Adam, right? So when we see Shinji as a crucified character, or even Rei as a crucified character, actually all our characters in Evangelion have to suffer. And in the end of Evangelion, they all kind of are destroyed as we see angels destroyed. There's sort of a cross goes up for each of them, in that they're not going to survive this impact, right? So let's go into this. It says, for the Nessenes, the universal ground is the original man, Adam. And knowledge of him is regarded as a beginning of perfection, as the bridge to the knowledge of God. He is male-female and comes from father and mother. He has three parts, the rational, the psychic, and the earthly. These three parts came down into one person, Jesus. And through the doctrine is related to the original man, Christ as the second Adam. The soul of three parts is a trinity. Therefore, the original man is mentions in Caribios and Oanes, the letter of a soul capable of suffering, so that the figure of the great, most beautiful and perfect man, humbled to be a slave, might suffer punishment. He is the blessed nature, hidden and revealed. So we start out here in this apocalyptic moment where there was lots of suffering, right? Nerve has been destroyed in a physical level. We see Asuka totally devastated by the mass production angels. Shinji goes up against it, then he gets sort of crucified into this higher form of an angel. You see Rei's transformation, right? And it becomes kind of a gate, right? It becomes a gateway in a lot of ways. This is what's very interesting. We go into this, Jung goes into this and says, the blessed nature of the hidden is revealed, and everything has come to be and will be, and the kingdom of heaven is sought within humans, and even in the children of 7 years, or in this case, the children of 14 years. On the face of it, this looks like the beginnings of a sexual theory, right, concerning the underlying psychic structure reminiscent of certain modern attempts of the same vein. This is for them a hidden and mystical logos. They are Osiris in the water. They are the substance of the seed. They are the Hermes as the logos. And you kind of see this, in Evangelion or End of Evangelion. There is a... Oh, this is interesting, though. It says, there's worshipped as the phallus, they become like the male organ, and has an every urge to lift upwards. And we see that lifting upwards of Rei, right? Rei lifts upwards, right? So there is this, and then you can also see in some of the dialogue that's going on with Shinji, both in the Neon Genesis Evangelion ending, but as well as in End of Evangelion, that has this libidinal desire, like, what is your desire? And you see the female characters all approaching Shinji as sort of a vision of what's open to him. So, maybe this is a good place to jump into another quick observation I had, where Shinji's Eva is a unicorn. And so maybe we can see it here. So if you look at this picture, you can see Eva Unit 1 has got the horn, right? You can see that horn in the top of Eva Unit 1. So I have another better, clear picture of it. Yeah, well, you can see Rei's does not have that. And here's an apocalyptic image of Rei and Eva Unit 0, and you have the Spear of Longinus. This is not from the show, but it's kind of, it does have all those elements, and it does have that apocalyptic imagery, right? You see this has got the red sky and the waters, and the Eva behind holding the spear. But I wanted to go into that concept of the unicorn, right? So here we see that unicorn horn, and again we see, we can see it very well here, right? So this one we can clearly see Unit 1, Shinji's unit, has got a unicorn horn. Again, here with the whole cast, right? The unicorn horn is right here. And here he's immolated by spears. This is sort of a crown of thorns sort of view, right? So, and here's a great picture of Adam, Cele, and Corono, and here's a picture of the End of Evangelion, so typical with Gendo. But I wanted to kind of talk a bit about that unicorn. So here we go to Jung, in Jungian alchemy. It's a whole section in psychology and alchemy on the unicorn. And you here see the heavenly horn of the moon is closely connected with the unicorn. It says, that's the ray of light. Now this is an interesting ray of light, right? Ray is the rays, right? And the ray of light, you often see there's a statue of Moses that has two horns. Well, they're actually rays of light. So it's sort of the ray of light, the logos, coming down into the unicorn. And here we see, like, one of the great tapestries from the 15th century, the hunt of the unicorn, right? The unicorn captured and cordoned off here, right? And this is sort of a bit like, this kind of image might sum up End of Evangelion in a real clear way, like Anno's relation to, we talked earlier about the break between Jung and Freud. But you had the break between Anno and his fans, where Anno was getting death threats. They didn't like the ending of Neon Genesis Evangelion. And Anno was sort of going through his own shadow work, right? Anno was going through his own work to understand his problems that he was working through and find his voice and produce great art, at the same time transforming it into art. And I think the redemptive side of it is he did produce the art, right? And so we see with this unicorn image, these associated unicorn symbols aim at giving no more than a sample of the extremely intricate, entangled connections between pagan and natural philosophy, Gnosticism, alchemy, ecclesiastical tradition, which in turn had a deep and lasting influence on the world of alchemy. I hope these examples have made clear for the reader just how far alchemy was a religious, psychological, or mystical movement. right? And I think that this is, here's a poem. It says, "We caught the beast called unicorn that knows and loves a maiden best and falls asleep upon her breast. We took from underneath his horn the splendid male carbuncle stone, sparkling against the white skull bone." And this is sort of like, again, the imagery of white, the imagery of the lance, the imagery of Ray past the moment. So I think that's going to give us a good tour of some concepts of Jung throughout End of Evangelion. I did want to wrap it up sort of in the theme of apocalyptic anime and some conclusion. I just wanted to read from Jung's Aion. It says, "It has been believed hitherto that the human shadow was the source of all evil. Now it can be ascertained on closer investigation that the unconscious human, that is, his shadow, does not consist only of morally reprehensible tendencies, but also displays a number of good qualities, such as normal instincts, appropriate relations, realistic insights, creative impulses, etc. On this understanding, evil appears merely as a distortion, a deformation, a misinterpretation and misapplication of effects. These falsifications and caricatures now appear as the special effects of anima and animus, the latter as the real authors of evil. But we cannot stop at even this realization, for it turns out that all archetypes spontaneously develop favorable and unfavorable, light and dark, good and bad effects. In the end, we have to acknowledge that the self is a complexio oppositorium, meaning a complex of oppositions, precisely because there can be no reality without polarity, right? If we call everything that God does or allows good, then evil too is good, and good becomes meaningless, right? So the idea here is, it must therefore be supposed that they spring from a need of human consciousness, and for that reason they lose their vitality and validity outside the human sphere. That is to say, a hypostasis of good and evil as metaphysical entities is inadmissible, because it would deprive the terms as meaning. So what is he talking about here? Talking about the chemical wedding, okay? And I think that some of the chemical wedding, what I mean here is the union of the opposites. There is good, there is evil. Look at all of our fallen characters throughout Neon Genesis Evangelion. Everyone goes with the second impact. Everyone goes, and nobody's saved. But yet Shinji does reach for Rei, right? Shinji tries to save Rei. And I think that saving her is something that is the bridge for us into Rebuild. Because if we look at Rebuild as an eternal recurrence, it's sort of Shinji wants to save Rei. He wants another chance. He wants a redo, right? And even though we'll get into later how we can't redo exactly. We have to relive it. I think that you'll see in Rebuild something that's interesting, because Lacan also wanted to do this work to revisit Freud. And I think that'll be interesting in our next lecture, or our next topics, right? Last on End of Evangelion and the apocalyptic side, and in that closing notes from Jung's Aion, what we do see here is, in his conclusion of the chemical wedding, that there is some redemption that's possible, right? So with Gendo, he did have some good intentions. The problem is Gendo hadn't worked out his own issues. Shinji has good intentions, but he didn't work out his issues. And this is sort of like all of us, right? So what apocalyptic genre does often is show us that the time has run out. But it shows us in a symbolic way, right? So with apocalyptic anime, we get to see the world end and then see what our characters do in that extreme position. But there's another way of looking at this. There's another way to look at this, which is, in Christian apocalypse, for example, we have the idea that the Christ returns, right? And the return of Christ is the redemption of the Christian apocalypse. This is second coming. And now, just like Anno hacks religion, I think that we could also hack it and just say, actually, every time one saves Rei, every time one puts the good of human interests, our fellow team, Shinji eventually does get back in the Eva. Rei sacrifices herself. We see that human story. And I think this is the place where Evangelion shows us that as we reboot into rebuild, that some of that effort does pay off, in the long hero's journey. And I think, with Jungian connection, the hero's journey is a lot of what this is about, right? So hopefully this was interesting to you guys. Like I mentioned in the lead out, we'll do Lacan next week. I think I'm cheekily calling it the rebuild of Freud, Lacan's rebuild of Freud. And we will talk about rebuild of Evangelion with the philosophy of Lacan. Talk a little bit about his mirror stage. We'll talk about his thoughts on desire, on synthome. Synthome is very interesting, which is like the symptom versus the cause of the problem. And we'll also talk a bit about Lacan's Freud project, how he revisits it. And we'll see how Anno has revisited the world of Evangelion for us to sort of do his own alchemy. There is some Jungian alchemy that we'll see in Rebuild as well. So looking forward to that one next week. And thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Check out the Flesh Android in the links below. And please leave your comments. Let me know what you think. Would like to turn this into a live broadcast at some point, but bear with me as we grow the audience and we can get that out there. So let me know what you think below, and share it if you think it's interesting, and we'll talk to you next week. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.